Welcome, everybody. So glad to have you and have you join us today. It's Friday, June 17th, and this is the 2022 Juneteenth Celebration, the vibrant legacy of Black Chicago. We are hosting this event in collaboration with the Northwestern Office of Diversity and Inclusion. I am Rabia Dadu. I am a clinical research associate with the Center for Health Equity Transformation at Northwestern University Weinberg School of Medicine, which is also part of the Institute for Public Health and Medicine at Northwestern. Our center's mission is to lift health for all by exposing root causes of health inequities and also serving as a hub that pushes boundaries in research, education, workforce development, and community engagement. Very excited to have our speakers today. Very excited to see everybody join us today in learning more about what this day means, Juneteenth. Believe it or not, it was just a year ago today that the United States government declared Juneteenth, which acknowledges June 19th of 1865, a federal holiday in observance of the emancipation of enslaved African Americans in Galveston, Texas, which happened 2 years after Abraham Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. So that's what occurred a year ago when President Biden signed that into law. Today, we'll talk about history, of course, culture, place, and the significance of Juneteenth, Chicago, and beyond. We'll find out some cool facts. I'm excited to learn something new today, and I hope you all do as well. I'm honored to moderate today's event with our esteemed guests. We have today Sherman Dilla Thomas, Chicago urban historian and TikTok sensation, and also Dr. Mary Pattillo, Harold Washington Professor of Sociology and African American Studies at Northwestern University. I'll start with a short intro for Dilla. Dilla is at heart a powerful storyteller. He has been actively preserving and sharing the rich history and culture of Chicago, highlighting its people, architecture, and impact on the world. He has been featured on many news media outlets and has a regular series on our very own WBEZ Chicago, local NPR news station. It's called Chicago's History Moment. And he's also a freelance writer and content creator for the historic Chicago Defender and the award-winning nonprofit news source Block Club Chicago. Dilla's entertaining and engaging history lessons have also taken the national stage at the Today Show, on NBC's First Look, and also on the Kelly Clarkson Show. So through storytelling and history, Dilla is changing the narrative about Chicago. Dr. Mary Pattillo is a author and Harold Washington Professor of Sociology and Chair of the Department of African American Studies at Northwestern University. Dr. Pattillo studies race and ethnicity, urban sociology, inequality, housing, education, and criminal studies in Black communities and using qualitative methods. Her books include Black Picket Fences in 1999, a published publication investigating the economic, spatial, and cultural forces that affect child rearing and youth socialization in a Black middle-class neighborhood on Chicago's South Side. Her second book, called Black on the Block in 2007, focuses on gentrification and public housing transformation. In a recent publication called Black Advantage Vision, Dr. Pattillo flips the script on racial inequality research by introducing a new paradigm that focuses on the positive outcomes and advantages of Black people. So I'd like to give a big warm welcome to Dilla and Dr. Thomas to our 2022 Juneteenth celebration, the vibrant legacy of Black Chicago. I'd like to take it away, speakers. Whoever would like to go first.
Oh, well, I guess I'll go first. One, I want to pre-apologize about the sound. It'll be a lot better in just a moment. I'm sort of in transit. I'll entertain you guys with a quick, brief story. I was doing a neighborhood tour today for the Chicago Bears rookies, the ones they just drafted. And so the Bears sent a Mercedes sedan to the house to pick me up to make sure that I was on time for the tour. And then I told them, hey, I got to leave at 11. They said, yeah, the limo will be outside. Limo was not on time to take me home to do my Northwestern Juneteenth presentation. So now the Bears owe me one. But I'm extremely humbled to be before you, to be a member of this panel. I am a big Northwestern fan, not just of the football team, right? But I'm a Northwestern Memorial Hospital baby. That's the place where my family gets our health care. And then my favorite Chicagoan to ever draw breath is a gentleman by the name of Earl B. Dickerson. He's the first African American to be passed the bar to graduate University of Chicago Law School. But as it relates to Northwestern, he's the first Black grad of the Northwestern High School Lab School of Evanston. And so very, very pleased to be here with you all, and thank you.
Glad to have you, Dilla, and safe travels. It's like you're doing almost like a live history tour right now.
So did you want to go first, Dilla, with your comments, or because I think as the historian, that might be good for you to go first, or how would you like to go?
Oh yeah, us historians don't mind running our mouths at all. And I guess it's very appropriate to start with the history of Juneteenth, right? And in particular, for me, how it relates to Chicago. I guess our host already eloquently described Juneteenth and why we celebrate that holiday. And that's sort of the ending of it. Before we get to the freeing of enslaved African Americans do so. And Chicago was very pivotal in that abolitionist fight. We've all famously heard about Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman brought people via the Underground Railroad to places like Roseland and Calumet City because of its proximity to the Calumet River. We also if you're of my age or a little older, you may have heard of a movie called House Party. All right, we all do the Kid and Play dance. I bring that up because it was written and directed by the Huttons. The Huttons by the name of Joseph Hutton. He was the head custodian of the Chicago Board of Trade, and during the Great Chicago Fire of 1871, when the building was burning, are in the building because he knew who they were as the janitor. But by that point, though, 1871, he had been in Chicago for maybe 20 years. His brothers, Peter and another brother that we do not know the name of because he escaped to Canada, they set up an Underground Railroad stop. And so one stayed in Alton, Illinois, and we all know the history behind Alton, Reverend Lovejoy, and their push for abolition. So one brother stayed there. Joseph Hutton came to Chicago. Another brother went to Canada. And together, they worked the Underground Railroad, right? You stop in St. Louis, you stop in Chicago, and you make it onto Canada via Lake Michigan and the Great Lakes. The brother in St. Louis, oddly enough, his son becomes the coach that teaches Arthur Ashe to play tennis, right? And so Chicago certainly has had an impact, but as it relates to just the freeing of African Americans from chattel slavery, man, was Chicago very, very pivotal. We had a gentleman by the name of John Jones, who's Illinois' first civil rights activist. He's one of the gentlemen that helped reverse the Black laws that Illinois formerly had. A lot of people don't know that we were state founded in 1818, but slavery was legal in the state of Illinois until 1837 down in the southern portion. It was so because that particular area was formerly owned by the Spanish. Illinois has been in Spanish hands, French hands, of course, the English hands, and then American hands. But that when it was in Spanish hands, we were a part of the Virginia territory, which slavery was legal then, and the deal had been worked out to where they could have slavery in those salt mines, right? And so because of that, it also made Illinois, after the fugitive slave laws was passed, made us a hub for slave catchers to come to Illinois. And then all they would need to do is make it to the southern point of Illinois. They could claim those African Americans as descendants of those who were already slaves of the salt mines. But before I pause and turn it over, one of my favorite Chicago stories is to tell just about our spirit. If you look in the Cairo, Illinois archives, you'll see a story dated about the 1850s. A escaped enslaved African American had made it to Chicago. The slave catchers were made aware where he was, and they came to Chicago proper to retrieve him. The Chicago constable came out to them and said, "Hey, I understand we just passed this fugitive slave law, and I don't want to break any federal laws. So you say he's a slave, I'm gonna send him back with you. But here in Chicago, we check to see if they have any warrants or if they owe any white men any money before we send them back down south because we got to protect our laws too." So the slave catcher would say, okay, well, yeah, go ahead, do what you got to do. I'll be standing out front. And every single time that Chicago constable would take the African-American man or woman through the front door, let him out the back, come back to the slave catcher and say, man, those black guys are so fast here in Chicago. But they would also warn them to not still be there at the end of the night. We all famously heard of the Abraham Lincoln and Stephen A. Douglas debates. And what we spend little time discussing is that Stephen A. Douglas was going to win, but he voted for the Missouri Compromise, which moved slavery up a couple states. And here in Chicago, we were so anti-slavery. We didn't vote for the hometown hero, right? We voted for Lincoln, sending him to the United States Senate and thusly on to the presidency. So again, just honored to be here in this discussion. I know we celebrate Juneteenth as a holiday that starts in Galveston, Texas, but those folks become free because of a lot of wonderful things that Chicagoans did. And finally, right, one of the pivotal battles of the Civil War is the Battle of Gettysburg. And the first shots fired in that battle were from an Illinois regiment, where 1/3 of them were from Chicago.
All right. Thank you so much for that, Dilla. I could sit here and listen all day. So maybe we'll do a little back and forth. So hello, everyone. Thank you to Chet for inviting us. It's really a pleasure to be here. I'm a sociologist, not a historian, so I'm going to be much more contemporary. And Araceli, if you could share my slides. Excellent. Thank you so much. So the title of my talk today is Black Chicago Ain't Dead, Toward a Black Chicago Revival. So as we see on our first slide, Chicago, if you could advance to the first slide, please. I think that, so this is the, yep, first slide, please. There we go. So you all have heard a lot about the Black Chicago, the decline in the population of Black Chicago over the last, we often think it's just 20 years, but it's really more 40 years. And that number is 363,000 people, a decline in the Black population in Chicago over that time period. If you go to the next slide, we see that that is a lot of Black people. Yes, that is more than the Black population of Atlanta. And on the next slide, we see it is more than the Black population of Washington, D.C. And if we go to the next slide, we see it is more than the Black population of Dallas. And I think we have one more city on the next slide. Yes, it is almost as much as the Black population in Los Angeles, not quite as much. But if we go to the next slide, we see that that does not mean that Chicago has a small Black population. Despite that population loss, there's still 833,693 as of 2019. And here I say generously, any of you all who work with census statistics know there are many ways to define people by race. And so this is the Black alone or in combination, including Black Hispanic. So that's why I say generously. So the alone or in combination means on the census, you can check more than one box. So you can be Black and Native American, Black and Asian. So this is all those folks who check more than one box. And of course, you have an ethnicity, either you're Hispanic or not, and then you check a race. And so this is Black folks who checked Hispanic, Black folks who didn't check Hispanic, and Black folks who checked more than one box. So this is the generous number, but nonetheless, it doesn't actually change that much if you use the more restrictive number. And my point here is that that's a lot of Black people. And that's why Chicago is still Black metropolis. This word, this term, Black metropolis, is something I'll be using a bit. It is the title of the book by St. Clair Drake and Horace Caton, published in 1945. About Chicago then and updated a few times since then. And it really, I think, captures how we want to think about vibrant Black Chicago today. So if you see on the next slide, numbers alone don't make Black Chicago a Black metropolis. That distinction comes from the vibrancy that exists in the organizational and social life of Chicago. So the most recent local estimates that we can have of all Black-owned businesses are that there are 78,000 Black-owned businesses in Chicago. Now that number seems, I know, like that cannot be. This includes people who are sole proprietors. So these are people who are self-employed, as well as people who have employees. If we just focus on businesses with employees, the more recent data show that there are 4,142 Black-owned businesses with employees in Chicago, and that's as of 2019. But if we go back to that 78,000 number from 2012, that number of businesses show sales receipts of $3.7 billion. So this is the vibrancy of Black business Chicago. We can think politically, 20 out of 50 Black aldermen and women, and dozens of state and US representatives. We can think religiously, 395 Black, and this is just Protestant churches in Cook County. We can think some things that aren't on the slides, educationally, 305 majority Black schools in Chicago, 40 chapters of Black Greek letter organizations in the Chicago's Pan-Hellenic Council, and the national headquarters of the Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority, 4 predominantly Black institutions of higher education, 2 Black-owned radio stations, 1 Black-owned bank, and the last slide I have up there is the Bud Billiken Day Parade. So this is the richness of Black organizational Chicago. And we can also think about Black Chicago digitally. 36,000 Twitter followers for @Asada's Daughters, over 64,000 followers for BLM Chicago, 241,000 followers for @Eve Ewing, who's a poet and fellow sociologist. So I want to give her a shout out, and that was before she left Twitter. And 8.1 million followers for Black Chicago rapper @Chance the Rapper. Dilla, I'm sure I should have put your number up there, but you know best your number of followers, so you can tell us that.
Yeah, 90,000 followers on TikTok.
Excellent, excellent. So that is what brings me to say that this is evidence that Black Chicago ain't dead. Nonetheless, with the constant barrage of Black news, bad news, the Chirac label, especially when, not even just when Trump was in office, but still now always using Chicago as a kind of poster city for crime and violence, always a top ranking in racial residential segregation. Many of these things make it very hard to celebrate Black Chicago. And it sometimes makes me sound a little blind to the real hardships and suffering that Black Chicagoans endure. So I don't want to do that. I don't want to overlook those things. But I do want to point out that paradoxically, it was in 1917 when Robert Abbott, the publisher of the Chicago Defender, called for what was called the Great Northern Drive, which we now think of as the Great Migration. 1917, this was a racial atmosphere in Chicago combustible enough that in 1919, just 2 years later, we had the great race riots of 1919. So Abbott was calling for a Great Northern Drive to Chicago at a time when it was no paradise, it was no promised land, but nonetheless had opportunity and vibrancy and joy and organizational strength. And so that's the kind of booster that I want to be right now. It's the booster of Black Chicago despite its defects. And this, if you show the next slide, please. If we think about this as a kind of rhetorical, somewhat joking question about make Chicago Black again. Now, it's rhetorical because Chicago has never been a majority Black city. It's never been an official chocolate city as Washington, D.C. had been. It's never had a population over 50% Black. The highest it's been is about 36% Black. Chicago's always been very multicultural. So it really isn't about that, but rather about building on this tradition of this vibrancy of Black Chicago. Next slide, please. So I do this by building off of Drake and Caton's Black Metropolis. because their framework is really enduring. They have this framework of counterposing what they call the Black ghetto and Black metropolis. They sometimes use the Black ghetto and Black belt interchangeably, and Black metropolis or Bronzeville or the South Side interchangeably. The Black ghetto is the spatial manifestation of racism. It is where, in that part of the book, they graph and count and narrate how racism fixes the status of Black people into what they find to be, at that time, quote, servant jobs and neighborhoods rife with tuberculosis and poverty. But then the whole second half of the book is about Black metropolis, about what they call a tenacious clinging to life, about a struggle for liberty, about a quest for happiness. And this nomenclature is really, really important, because what we know is that outsiders have a hard time seeing Black metropolis, seeing Bronzeville. All they see, and mostly what they read about, is the Black ghetto. So I want to focus on Black metropolis in building this case for a Black Chicago revival. Next slide, please. So calling for a Black Chicago revival is about standing our ground in this city and reclaiming parts of Chicago that are trying, or reclaiming this cultural legacy that are really being reclaimed by new people moving in. So I'll just, again, harken back to Drake and Caton, who wrote in 1945, quote, "Chicago's master plan calls for the eventual reclamation of the inner city. Here it is hoped members of the new middle class will make their homes close to the loop where they work and well within the city limits. The blighted areas will thus be reclaimed." So they were quite prescient in 1945 to see what has become the South Loop and the West Loop, which were the blighted areas of their day, and now are, of course, extremely dense, high income, new housing areas. And so my talk today is really about seeing these cycles of dispossession and removal and trying to intervene through Black creativity, Black demand, and Black rootedness. So next slide shows that Black creativity is easily represented in Chicago through the arts. These are just some pictures of major Black artistic organizations, but it's not just the arts where creativity is found in Chicago. Black creativity is manifest in the plethora of Black service provider organizations, teachers, investors, coaches, ministers, mentors, gardeners and farmers, block club members and political activists working collaboratively to heal wounds and cultivate assets so that Black Chicago can flourish. Black creativity builds upon the previous generations of Black Chicago. And what it does is recognizes how much Black Chicagoans have built Chicago that now new people are benefiting from, and refuses to let the fruits of that labor be capitalized upon without Black people's participation and presence today. Next, the next slide, please, is Black demand. Yeah, the next one, yep. So this is a map done by a group at Duke University, research on contract buying in Chicago in the 1960s. And it shows properties in this neighborhood that were bought on contract. On contract meant that the Black buyer, who couldn't get a loan from a traditional bank because of redlining, was contracting with the white owner, but never really had any possession of the deed, but was led to believe that they owned the property. They were responsible for all maintenance. And if they missed a payment, the owner could very quickly pull the property back. It was a very exploitative process. And so Black demand really rests on highlighting the truth about how much of white wealth and advantage has been built on these unequal systems in the public and private sectors that have greased the wheels of white success. Black demand is about recognizing this centuries-long history and redressing it with investments that benefit Black people. So this particular report found that, quote, between 75% and 95% of homes sold to Black people, Black families during the 1950s and 60s were sold on contract, 75 to 95%. The amount of wealth land sales contracts expropriated from Chicago's Black community was between $3.2 and $4 billion. These authors continue, quote, contract selling enjoyed the backing of the very banks that turned down Black home buyers and of investment syndicates comprised of white Chicago lawyers, doctors, downtown business leaders, and city government officials, all of whom profited handsomely by exploiting a separate and unequal housing market to the disadvantage of Black families, end quote. So these were everyday white Chicagoans. Well, not every day, but professional white Chicagoans. They weren't the richest of the rich. They were Black professionals buying into these syndicates that then bought these properties that then sold them on land contracts multiple times to different families that expropriated this wealth. Then finally, next slide, please, Black rootedness. While being stuck in disadvantaged places has had repercussions for generations, staying, oops, I think you skipped one. There we go, thank you. Staying in a place as it improves is a good thing. So the problem is that just as places start to get better, Black people start to get displaced. So according to a UIC report, $1.7 billion in Chicago city government investments has been concentrated in places, quote, where gentrification has resulted in a decline of the Black population and an increase in the white population, end quote. So this suggests that Black erasure is oftentimes a prerequisite for white investment. So we need to stay rooted. We need to counter the force of Black removal by insisting on policies and efforts that protect Black people in Black neighborhoods. These are affordable housing preservation and new construction, property tax relief, community land trusts, emergency rental assistance, community benefits agreements, rent control, preferential housing vouchers. These are just a few of the measures. Sometimes these measures come in as stopgap measures once we know that a neighborhood has gotten hot and we think that there will be displacement. But we also need ongoing investments in Black neighborhoods before they get hot, ongoing and special investments in schools and parks and libraries and health centers and art, as I mentioned on the creativity side. Such improvements will allow Black families who want to stay rooted to do so. Last slide, or next slide, please. These investments are the anchors of healthy places. Again, there are 833,693 Black people in Chicago in 2019. Putting these investments and resources where Black people already are, rather than what much of our policy does. Much of our policy tries to incentivize Black people to move out. I'm a sociologist. Moving to opportunity was one of those big such projects. Or driving Black people away in search of them because of our underinvestment. These things, I would argue, are short-sighted when we can see a near million population of Black folks right here in Chicago right now. In doing these investments requires the combination of Black creativity, demand, and rootedness. Black population loss in Chicago hasn't occurred in a historical or structural vacuum. And so it also takes the commitment of our public officials and those of us who vote for our public officials to intervene in these cycles of urban change and disinvestment. And when we do so, we can recognize the profound value and presence of Black Chicago from well before Drake and Caton in Black Metropolis, and what we hope is into the future. And I'll stop there. And I think either we can turn it back or we can have some Q&A or some back and forth conversation.
Ooh, I'm so glad I went first and I ain't have to follow that. Everybody would have been mad at me, and that would have been terrible. So many powerful things out of what you said. I think about, so I do neighborhood tours, shameless plug, right? And when I'm doing Bronzeville or North Lawndale tours, I always point out the vacant lots. But one thing I want to kind of, that goes perfectly with what you said is, so when we think about Chicago architecture, there are two things that jump out at us, right? The Chicago bungalow, the Chicago two flat. And I'm talking about the Czechs two flats on the west side. This is your standard facade brick two flats, right? Not the gray stones, right? So two flats in the bungalows are Chicago's backbone real estate. And when they were constructed, right, we call it the bungalow belt, 0 of them newly constructed had African Americans living in them, because all of them were inside of neighborhoods that had restrictive racial covenants, right? And so when you look at Bronzeville, call it 18th Street to 51st, right, you don't even really see any bungalows over there at all. You also don't see any of the newer style two flats, newer being 1920s, which is a great way to see, right, the disinvestment started in those neighborhoods right when we were building our bungalows. The other thing that I point out is you could get one of those. I'm sitting here right now, I made it home, talking to you guys in a bungalow that I absolutely love. It's a Dunning style bungalow. My house was built in 1922. It cost maybe about $7,000 brand new. So these things are still standing, right? But it was $7,000 brand new. By the time African Americans have gotten through land contracts, restrictive racial covenants, and redlining, and they're finally able to legally, if you're lucky, get a mortgage, they were talking the late 1970s, right? Early 1980s. And the bungalows are going for about $45,000, $50,000, $60,000, right? So just think about that wealth gap, that of every single bungalow in Chicago and every single two flat, the numbers right now standing there, there's about 80,000 bungalows in the city of Chicago right now. And all of them have that wealth disparity, right? So someone was able to purchase in for $7,000, get equity in their home like we all hope to do. And on the back end, 2-3 generations later, are able to pull out $60,000 and then throw that into an inflation calculator of what that money's worth today. And to do that every time you see a bungalow, and you'll see why our neighborhoods are in the way that they are, right? We were totally robbed, and I love that you point that out. Another thing that I like to mention is that, as she stated, people saw these things coming. And so the neighborhood that I like to point out is the Pullman neighborhood, right? South Chicago neighborhood. Founded by George Mortimer Pullman, right? It was a company town, the neighborhood of Pullman was. So after the Pullman labor strike and all that other stuff goes on, after the 1809 annexation of the town of Pullman, we say to every resident over there, you have 10 years to buy this property that you're in. Because if you were a Pullman employee, the town of Pullman owned the property, and they didn't allow their employees to buy any of those houses or apartment buildings that you see in Pullman. But then when we annexed the neighborhood, we gave everybody there 10 years. I have read newspaper articles in Cabrini Green and IWLs from the 1970s, early 1970s, where they were saying, hey, there's too many people in here. Why don't you allow for us to knock a wall down, turn these things into condos? They were calling them a different term for condos then. What damn, so man, I can't think of that term right now, but it's the same way Parkway Gardens started, right? Co-ops. They were saying, let's turn these into cooperatives and let us own them and watch the crime and everything else go down. And time after time after time, the city said no, only to tear them down and gentrify them, right? So again, I love you saying Black Chicago ain't dead. Not only is it not dead, it's been fighting for a very long time for sustainability. And what I like to say, the rest of the Black America owes Black Chicago so much of a debt, right? We break every major sport here in Chicago, right? Don't let them fool you. Jackie Robinson is the guy that broke baseball. The East-West All-Star Negro League game is what breaks baseball. All the white owners came to Chicago year after year and saw our talent, and that's what makes them want to say, hey, we got to pick one, and Jackie is who they pick. Same thing happens with basketball. and the Harlem Globetrotters. Same thing happens with football. My brother Fitz Pollard from Rogers Park. And so our Black struggle of humanity, right, emboldens African Americans all across this country. You know, again, it's as Chicago goes, so goes the rest of the country. Brother Horace and Drake's Clayton and Drake's book, well, sociology as a discipline comes from Chicago, but if there's any Black sociology of studying of Black folks being done, that's the Bible. And it's still true to this day. It can be applied to any metropolitan area in the country, and they use Chicago as the backdrop because we are the microcosm of Black America for sure. Okay, now I'll shut up because historians will talk their butt off.
Well, I just don't know from the organizers if you want to go to the Q&A or do you want Dilla and I to talk? Because we can go back and forth.
However you both would like it. We do a few Q&A if you wanted to, yeah, you kind of like check a few of the questions and see if that prompts any more discussion. There is one from, do you have one in mind, Dr. Pattillo?
Yeah, well, I just, the types of laws that are in place to close the gap of proper financing. Well, I mean, there's the Community Reinvestment Act. That's what's supposed to do that. The Community Reinvestment Act was meant to address the disinvestments from communities of color. It has not been completely successful, and for that, I will just quickly share my screen again for those of you all who this is work that that WBEZ has done, and this is the percentage of dollars loaned by the racial makeup of the neighborhood. And basically you see the top line headline, 68.1% of dollars loaned for housing purchases went to majority white neighborhoods. This is Chicago, while just 8.1% went to majority Black neighborhoods and 8.7% went to majority Latinx neighborhoods. And this is today. So these, the Community Reinvestment Act is meant to do that, but banks, you know, the kind underwriting is, I mean, there's so many layers to this. Underwriting itself can kind of bake in racial disparities and racial inequities from previous home evaluations. There's racism there. I could kind of give you a whole reading list on this. This is, of course, a whole semester class, but I just wanted to at least establish the foundation that the answer to the question is the Community Reinvestment Act, and the answer still is that that has not been completely effective.
Reminds me of not Thomas Jefferson, Andrew Jackson, right? The Supreme Court passed something, again, it's escaping me, it'll come in 5 seconds. And then what Andrew Jackson said was, okay, you got your law, now let's see you enforce it, right? And that's sometimes where we fall into like what's put in the stopgaps to fix things. Absolutely something amazing that a whole bunch of big brain people spent 2 years to write and fought it through all kind of committees and subcommittees and blase blahs, and then it'll get enacted and signed, and then let's see you enforce it, right? And the rubber don't meet the road there.
Dilla, I'd like to hear your answer to this question. What suggestions do you have to help prevent Juneteenth from becoming just another day off or meanerless or commercialized holiday?
I don't like my answer at
I
all.
want to hear it.
They have however your faith beliefs are, that's your business, ain't mine. But if you find yourself to be a believer, they have commercialized Jesus Christ himself. Do you think that a group of our countrymen who commercialize the Lord and Savior on the literal cross, you can buy it? You got to know that Juneteenth is going to happen. What I would have did with the Juneteenth ice cream and everything else, okay, now that you have this Juneteenth trademark, will you please, in writing and policy, show me that 40% of your profits from trademarking Juneteenth is going to go to people who were affected by the whole chattel slavery thing, right? Like that's where the empowerment is. Because if you say no, they're going to figure out some kind of other shady, closeted way to do it, right? Somebody with like less integrity than Dilla will trademark Juneteenth anyway and not own none of it because it then blah, 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 right? But no, okay, the King family is a great example of that. You know what? Yes. Go ahead, throw Dr. Martin Luther King on that shirt. We're gonna need 30%, my brother. You're gonna need to keep this King Library in Atlanta open and running security here is a little expensive, right? I think that's the way to attack it. Money is what put the Black Lives Matter signs in all the downtown buildings. Wasn't any kind of talking. It was the kids downtown broke some windows and they didn't want to spend no more money. So every building down there got Black Lives Matter. And I think that's the same way to treat them with Juneteenth, right? They're this is a capitalistic country. And so we need to try to capitalize off that from them and just give us our cut. You can do what you want, my brother.
So I will tackle this question. That was a great answer. I totally agree. I'm not sold on Juneteenth as a holiday. I mean, once I grew up going to Juneteenth parades and festivals all the time. Milwaukee, we celebrate Juneteenth since 1970. So it's since the 1970s. Not all Black communities have, but yeah, it is an interesting, I'm thinking about it still. It's only been a year. But I want to address this question. What are some of the indicators that a neighborhood is getting hot so that policies can be put in place proactively instead of reactively to prevent displacement? This one is a kind of easy question, actually, because gentrification is it's a game of profit. And so it waits for prices to hit bottom or tries to guess the bottom to buy property low and sell property high. So we should expect that our most disinvested places will become our next hot real estate places. And at the same time, though, so my research is on the Black middle class, and I have, there's some research coming out of the Chicago Fed about the disinvestment from middle class neighborhoods, especially middle class neighborhoods of color in Chicago. And it's that process. For example, one of the biggest things is tax sales. Homes in the bungalow belt, exactly what Dill is talking about. These are Black lower middle class folks who bought a home in the bungalow belt and then lose it for taxes, being bought up by institutional investors or just having the property values in these places decline. And there will come a time when it is so cheap that then investors will come and take the risk. And so my point is, intervening even that far in advance, not when it's, yes, we should invest in neighborhoods that are very disinvested, where there's high poverty rates and so on, but especially looking at lower middle class neighborhoods with people of color, that especially this, losing homes to tax sales, this is where the government where Cook County can make some decisions about helping folks stay in their home and keep the wealth that they have started to build. So that's my answer there.
I'm writing for the Sun-Times. I hope before the month is over, this thing I'm calling Black Flight. I'm wondering, do you give it any thought? I love that you brought that up. Sadly, we lost my parents' house to a tax sale situation, right? And after parents pass, and you got private old folks that don't tell you their business, and then you look up and it's like, again, they skipped that house for multiple years, right? They're asking themselves like, dang, Mom, how do you owe $13,000? But sorry, someone does indeed come and purchase it, and they'll quick deed you out of it. So many things. But then the other thing, like I said, I'm writing about it. I piss my friends off all the time. There's a certain, you're the sociologist, right? You could probably put some numbers to it. But there's a demographic of us, and by us I mean, I'll describe it, right? I fortunately had a two-parent home. A lot of my friends maybe a one-parent home. Mother did not attend college, right? And then so you go to public schools, and because your mom works with you a little at home, right? You read a little better than your class, then your standardized test scores are a little better than everybody else, right? And then once you've shown that separation, they separate you, right? They come and pull you to gifted classes and this and the third, right? And then they always find that program for you to play baseball, right? Your mom don't have the money. And, my long-winded point is these programs kind of get you through and get you to college, and then you become successful. And then you say, oh, I'm not moving back over there. It's dangerous, right? And then you move to a place that they don't really want you anyway, a place that you can't afford the taxes of, and we don't come back and retain those houses. I just read, I think in WBEZ, that second generation and third generation family homes for Blacks is also on the decline. But I call it the Black flight, right? Those of us who went to college on financial aid and all those things, you get home and you shun those things, right? Like, forgive student loans. I paid mine. You should pay yours. Pull your boots up, right? And then they move to the suburbs. I'm also very much interested. Is that also part of the problem?
Yeah, I think those are excellent points. My worry, so, I think there are some political and kind of, there are political statements in all of the things that we're talking about. What I tried to say in my talk is, for Black folks who want to stay, I want to talk about a Black Chicago revival. So I'm like you, I still live in Chicago. I wasn't born and raised here, but I live in Chicago. I live in a neighborhood very much like the kind of neighborhood I grew up in Milwaukee, that kind of thing. At the same time, I don't want to tell all Black folks where they need to live. And so I hear what you're saying. We all then, though, have our frustrations of our Black friends who move to neighborhoods where their children are the only Black child in school, and they're frustrated. And I'm like, well, then, but that's part of what you did. So
I guess I'm sorry, let me better ask. I guess I'm calling it Black flight because as I'm on my tours, I hear white flighters say, we stayed on the West Side until '68, and then somebody broke in on my dad's radio out his car, and we were gone. We sold the house that next month, right? And I hear that same, and my response to them is, well, what if you would have formed neighborhood watches with your Black neighbors, right? The neighborhood would have probably got better. I guess my same thing is why I'm calling it Black flight is, unfortunately with crime, right? As soon as one of our children's classmates gets shot or involved in gang life, then it's that same type of thought. It isn't, well, let me engage and try to bring crime down and try to see how I can get people off the streets. Is let me get away from that. And that's what I'm calling Black flight.
Yeah, and I think you're exactly right. And that's where, again, I feel unqualified to kind of jump, because you're right that when you got kids, some people got to make that decision. I got to go now. But I will say that there is a great book called Block by Block, Neighborhoods and Public Policy on Chicago's West Side, which is about this white flight on the West Side. And basically her answer is, not all white people were running from neighborhoods where Black folks were moving in. And in fact, the city of Chicago, and of course, the policies that were drawing people to the suburbs, were in some regards pushing white folks out who wanted to stay, who were trying to organize with their Black neighbors. And it was very difficult to do so. And they were not getting any traction. They were not, the city was not investing in those neighborhoods as they were starting to change. And so the alternatives, which was, highly subsidized suburban movement, became much more attractive, and white people could do that. And of course, Black people couldn't. But there were those kinds of efforts in the 60s, in the 50s and 60s at that time.
Can you throw that book in the chat, please?
Sure will.
I'm looking for a pen right now. I don't want to be reaching everywhere. What is it called? I might be looking at it. That's a very excellent point. I'm always pointing out, I guess I didn't apply it wide enough, but I am aware of the fight that our Greek Chicagoans put up to stay and how they were displaced for the Congress Expressway and how they indeed were loving living next to the Soul Brothers, right, who just came back home from World War II. And they had a lot of cultural similarities they were learning in the Expressway, kind of divided them.
So Dilla, I'm going to ask you a question from the Q&A. When we talk about critical race theory and society's systems of oppressions, how can we talk about it without alienating others? So you're with a whole, wide range of folks when you do these tours. Does critical race theory come up? Do you think about alienating each other, alienate people?
There was this poll done by Netflix viewers after 12 Years a Slave had came up, and it asks, how would you like historical information? And basically the answer was, give me a little honey with my medicine, right? And so that poll has always stuck out with me. There are folks, militant-minded folks, who want you to leave mad and pissed and question things. I want you to leave wondering how you can help. I want your perspective shifted to where even if you're not thinking how you can help, you're thinking, I just don't want to hurt then, right? And so I am like thinking about people's feelings. And I don't know if that's a good thing or bad thing. I think as a person, right, I'm naturally sensitive. Most storytellers are, right? You feel the stories you tell over and over again. And this certainly weighs on your emotions. And then I think for me, because of my day job, I started off as a meter reader. And I'll never forget, right? This lady had a lawn jockey, a black dude with the horse around his neck. And I would never read her meter, right? I would always skip it. I would just be like, bird poo or 10 dogs or whatever, right? And then finally, so then that caused her to get estimated bills. My boss tried me on it once. You could probably listen to me and tell that I ain't the kind of person you're going to engage in verbal conversation with, make me do something that I ain't comfortable with. It ain't already go your way. So he left me alone. But then she confronted me one day. And we talked for 10 minutes that day. The next month I was in her neighborhood. We talked for 20 minutes that day. The next month I was reading the meters. I was getting in trouble. They was looking for me. I was standing there talking to her. That fourth month, that statue was gone, right? I don't know if that statue would have been gone if I would have went about it. Hey, that's racist as hell, blah, 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 blah. But one day I told her about the George Washington's Watchmen, right? And, I started basically explaining to her, like, my favorite sandwich here is an Italian beef. And it comes because Italian grandmas were discriminated against at the butcher. They would walk in and they wouldn't sell them the prime cuts of steak or whatever. They would get the butt of the steak, right? The least tender part of the steak. And because Italian grandmas are awesome here in Chicago, they would set them things on slow burner and do all the rest of their chores for the rest of the day. And then when their husbands came home, that thing was cooking for 8 hours. Anything you cook for 8 hours is gonna fall off the dang on bone. And because Irish and Italian grandmas of the 1920s and 30s had a lot of kids, she cut it thin so she can stretch it so that everybody can eat. And the trick is, it don't matter how good or bad the cut of meat is, just use great bread. Nobody will know the difference, right? And that's really where the Italian beef sandwich is born from. It's from that discrimination, right? And so it's hard to like not feel that same story applies to rib tips. Same exact thing. They wouldn't sell the brothers the full slab. So it was like, oh man, what's still meat on this bone? Now you go to a rib place to order rib tips, right? That's a shared history. And that's how I communicate.
There's one question that kind of leads to that, or connects to that in the chat. And how should a wealthy, predominantly white institution like Northwestern leverage our structural power and privilege to support Chicago Black Metropolis?
Admit that they had admit that there has been some issues, right? Either via admitting students or just where Northwestern chose to invest, right? Northwestern is just now getting ready to open the offshoot in Bronzeville, right? A version of the hospital. Yes, open it. At the beginning of the opening ceremony, say you're sorry for waiting to 2022 to get to Bronzeville when that neighborhood has been the height of Black population since 1883, right? So I think that's a great step. And then I think it's up to us, really. That's the problem, man. The institutions do what we say. We got to stop trying to follow them. You know what I mean? Like, don't send your kids to Northwestern and tweet and Instagram. Don't send your kids to places that don't promote Black and brown and Asian and LGBTQ spaces, and watch that. They'll figure it out. We won't have to.
And I'll just say procurement. I have been working. I was amazed at how hard it's been sometimes to use a Black caterer for events. I mean, as simple as that, it is mind-blowing. And we just celebrated our 50th anniversary of African American Studies, and we ended up not being able to use a Black caterer. And I was so frustrated. Ultimately, we were able to have all the liquor supplied by Black liquor vendors. And y'all, just so you know, they're Black breweries and Black tequila and Black wineries. And so we had a nice selection of the liquor part. But procurement, I would say Northwestern spends, I don't know how many millions of dollars, and we need to look at how much of that money we're spending with Black folks.
Yeah, or create a fund that helps. So even if you're going to have your requirements be as such, then create a fund that helps those who come from marginalized spaces to apply. I wanted to give away free neighborhood tours to CPS students, but to be a vendor, I needed like $15 million worth of varying insurance policies just to Zoom kids about the history of the schools that they go to. That's certainly a roadblock that shouldn't be, right? It's 2022. My liability and background and who I am and my work in talking to kids can be found out very quickly. You know, you shouldn't keep making me pay $500 for background checks. You do that so that only vendors who can afford to pay to play are vendors, and that certainly is harmful. Thank you for bringing that up.
That's right. Spot on, all of you. Wow, there's like unending good questions in the chat, but closing thoughts. I mean, you both are rock stars, and we thank you so much for being here today. Well, one thing, Dilla, which tour should we start with first?
You got to very appropriately start with the Bronzeville tour, but it doesn't just highlight the African-American influence on this country. You know, the Marx brothers lived on 44th and King Drive, right? The Black Wabash YMCA was constructed by Julius Rosenwald. It's a cultural tour, and I would love for you guys to take it. And then after that, let's go to Pullman.
All right, sounds good. Well, happy Juneteenth, and thank you both. And thank you to all our viewers and listeners. We really appreciate y'all, and we look forward to more.